and welcome everybody. Great to see all these faces. And it is also my pleasure to introduce today one of Italy's best-known novelists, Paolo Giordano. He was the youngest writer ever to win one of Italy's most prestigious literary award for fiction for his first novel, The Solitude of Prime Numbers, which sold about 1 million copies worldwide and translated into over 30 languages. Paolo is a physicist by training, has a PhD in particle physics, although he just told me his maths is getting a bit rusty, so I'm not going to ask him any tricky maths questions. And quite a few of his characters are scientists, like the protagonist of his latest novel, Tasmania, and I should say there are copies outside, which he'll be signing afterwards. And of course, the male protagonist in Solitude of Prime Numbers is a mathematician. And the fact that your characters are mathematicians and scientists informs the way that they see the world. Paolo was one of the first writers to tackle the COVID-19 epidemic with an influential essay that was written at the start of the Italian lockdown and went viral straight away with sort of over 3 million hits and so on. His new novel, Tasmania, tackles climate change and terrorism, fear of nuclear war, and our fears of losing control in what has become an increasingly frightening world. So Paolo, welcome to the Vienna Humanities Festival.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsty. Do you hear me? Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Misha, for the invitation, wherever you are, and to the organizers.
Paolo, you wrote that from the start of the pandemic, you started working more with reality. What did you mean by that?
Well, our reality started working more on us, somehow. It's weird because I've been working in writing, whatever that means, for 15 years now. And as you know, all writers today there's no thing such as a pure fiction writers. We all do different things. We all do different stuff. We write our books, but then we write articles for newspapers. We sometimes appear in the public debate. We interview other writers or artists. In my case, I've been teaching scientific journalism, doing a lot of reportage. But somehow I had always seen these different kinds of writings as completely separate one from another. So now I'm doing a reportage, now I'm writing a novel, so I'm doing this, like I'm going to this imagined world. And then in February 2020, things got very bad in Italy very fast. And as you well remember, it was the first Western country to be so severely hit. So there was, for at least 3 or 4 weeks, there was this sense of complete waste of control, losing all control, and a sort of juxtaposition of imagination and reality. Because Georgi before was talking a lot about time travels, and you might remember that during COVID there was a bit of time travel for all of us, because what we were seeing happening during a day was also a projection of things that would happen 2 weeks or 3 weeks or even a month later. And this was very difficult for people, including me, to understand. How do I take into account the near future in the reality that's happening now? And on the other hand, all these fields I had been touching on, science, articles, literature, reportage, they all collapsed together in the need of writing something very fast, very urgent. For the first time in my life, I thought that writing well and precisely about something and doing it fast could have a real impact on reality.
You know, you're normally quite a slow writer.
I'm a slow writer, and I feel the frustration of doing something that is mostly, no, I wouldn't say the word irrelevant. I would say the word, the Italian word I would say is superfluo, which I don't know.
Superfluous?
Superfluous, does that exist? Yeah. So at that moment, it wasn't. And, you know, there was so much confusion on TV, on the news. Everybody was...
Did you feel this, like this urgency that you had to write about?
Yes.
Had to write about what was happening, that it was no longer okay as a novelist to disappear into the world of the imagination and write a love story or whatever. I mean,
because I could understand the math. You started from math. And, you know, in those first days, it was all about math, but math meant dead people. It was a direct consequence. But you could only see those people getting infected and endangered and eventually dying. You could only see it in the plots, in the future, in the math. And so...
Did you feel, therefore, an obligation as somebody who's a trained mathematician to do the numbers, to explain the numbers?
Yeah. To put it into words, but also to... You know, scientists are not very used to talk. And, well, Tasmania is also a lot about that. There's also some teasing of, you know, experts. We've seen so many experts talking, and we're always looking for experts in something. Sometimes they're scientists, sometimes they're geopolitics experts, but whatsoever. But the problem with experts, especially in science, is that, I mean, they're expert. They know things. Doesn't mean they know how to talk about things and take into account what has been the most complicated thing throughout the whole pandemic, and even now, the soul of people, how people react to scientific, to fact-based truth, how they deny it, how they don't want to hear it, either how they get scared by it. So I thought a writer could be useful for once.
So that's the essay that you write during COVID, and your latest novel, Tasmania. Tell us a little bit about. Tell us briefly the story of that. What the narrative is in that.
Well, it's we'll call it like a personal narration, only because there's an I narrator that is called PAOLO and works for Il Corriere della Sera and is born on my same day, but it's a fictional character. And the novel starts in the moment in which he and his wife realize that they won't be able to have kids of their own. So she actually realizes it before him, so she gives up, and he's somehow left alone with this delusion, with this disappointment, sorry, disillusion.
Disappointment,
yeah.
But he really wants to be a father and
yeah.
is...
And it doesn't happen. And this happens around November 2015, which was the month both of the Bataclan attack and the United Nations Conference on Climate in Paris, so two big events that happened in the same city at the same time, and I was there at that moment. And somehow the book covers the 3 years that follow, and it stops right before the start of the pandemic. So to me, it was a way to try and answer the question, who were we when we entered the situation? Who were we before? How come we ended up like this? And it's very weird because it's a novel that talks about 8 years ago, and I felt that I was writing somehow a sort of historical novel.
That's a good point, actually, because I was thinking that. I had to remind myself, because I was thinking, that seems so long ago, the Bataclan attacks, the Paris climate talks. But as you say, it's not that long ago. But I think it's almost like the things are changing so fast now in our society that the time becomes accelerated.
Yeah, and it's also very difficult to figure out, who we were. There were such dramatic changes also in the years of the terrorist attacks. When I was writing the novel, I did this work of research, I could call it. Month after month, I would go back and see what happened in Europe, especially in that moment. Georgi before was mentioning the election of Trump. All that happened in those years. A series of big and of small and very big traumas that happened very frequently, and somehow they changed the way we were living our lives. Think of terrorist attacks. I mean, traveling has completely changed. Going to concerts and events has completely changed after that. And it's just a few years ago, and somehow we don't think about terrorism anymore in Europe. And it was just there. It felt like a constant threat. I remember days when we were seeing the end of the world in what was going on. And then we saw the end of the world in the pandemic, and then we saw the end of the world in the invasion of Ukraine. So what I was really interested in is this feeling. The first part of the book is called In Case of an Apocalypse, and of course it's an ironic way to put it, but we're so connected to the constant idea of the end of the world, of collapse or of society and all that it's become a bit ridiculous in a way, and we have to learn how to be humans in it and how to, go on with our normal lives.
Well, that brings me to the question of the title, because you're probably wondering why a novel set largely in Paris, Italy, is called Tasmania. And that is about... yes, explain the title, because there's a physicist in the book. There's more than one physicist in the book, and they're having a conversation like, where would you go come the apocalypse?
The climate apocalypse, especially.
The climate apocalypse, yeah.
And, well, I saw, as I was writing, I saw this scientific paper, or pseudo-scientific. I was not really able to measure the level of seriousness of it, but it was a scientific paper, and the scientists there were rating the best places to find a shelter in case of collapse of civilization. And actually, we know that there are people who are doing this, very wealthy people in tech, for instance. They're buying land in very beautiful and expensive places. And the first place, the best place is supposed to be Tasmania, because it's an island, because it has fresh water in it. And what is very fascinating is that if you think of a collapse of the, let's say, human civilization, you get back to very basic things like fresh water and the fact there are no predators for humans. That also ranked it higher. And what was more troubling...
There are no human predators on Tasmania.
There are predators of human, like wild animals, like tigers, lions, those. But the most troubling aspect is that it's an island, so the scientists say, and I quote it in the book, it's easier to defend. Because one of the aspects that they were looking at is that, well, other people are going to want to have the same possibility, like it's happening already now at the borders of Europe. And so you're going to be able to defend yourself against it. So there was a very twisted meaning, this idea of a paradise, possible paradise of salvation, which at the same time is for very few people that are going to let the other ones drown. It's already there.
And why did you call I mean, you said the protagonist is called Paolo. He's Italian, he writes for the same newspaper as you do, he's also a novelist. I mean, is this autofiction? I mean, I mean, you said most of it's made up, but I mean, why did you make that decision as a writer?
Probably because after a year and a half of writing about, things that were happening day by day, I kind of lost faith in pure fiction. It's a form of faith, not the fact that we still like buy books and enter stories that are made up. And it's always been a very natural thing for me to do. Somehow I felt I had lost that connection. I was reading all the non-fiction.
Because reality was so overwhelming.
Yes.
Did you feel that there was space for the imagination?
Yeah, or there wasn't space in me. I mean, I wouldn't blame reality, I would just blame myself. I know it happened to other people. It was quite common in that moment not to be able to... well, actually there was no midway. There was no way in between. Either it was essays about reality, whatever it was, or I would watch Marvel movies of Spider-Man saving the world. And so there was no way in between. And so I said, okay, the first person this time I need to deceive somehow is myself. So I need to write this book as if each and every sentence is true. And then in the end, there's not a single sentence that is true to the facts. I thought it was interesting. I hated autofiction before. I hated this me thing. And I hope the book kind of slips out of it, because it's mainly a book where I listen to other people talking and other people's stories, and I try to collect them.
Yeah, I was going to say what's very clever is how the chaos of your characters' inner lives. So I mean, they're all having kind of problems in their marriages or personal relationships or whatever.
We all do.
And we all do. And but it seems to be refracted as well in what's happening, the uncertainty of the outside world. So there's a sort of mirroring, isn't there, from the chaos within and the chaos that we see outside.
Yeah, it's, as you said, when you try to list all these big crises that we went through in the last only 10 years, it looks as if there is a higher frequency of big crises than it was before. I don't know if this is true, but it feels like it. And the fact that it feels like it is already a problem in itself. One of the reasons for that might be that there was actually a revolution in the way that we are connected to the outside world. Now we all bring, really, through social media, smartphones and so on, there is this constant connection to even faraway crises. And so the time that even 20 years ago was devoted to the rest of the world was maybe, reading the newspapers in the morning, watching the news in the evening, but it was a part of the day. Today, if you're just a bit more connected than that, and a bit more anxious as a person, like I am, you can be constantly in touch with some crisis that is going on. So I wanted somehow to address this feeling and also to understand, okay, so how does this change our personal and intimate relationships? Because at some point, this amount of anguish that we receive constantly has to go somewhere. And it probably goes into our most intimate relationships. It affects them in ways that we still don't really understand. And then the other way around. How do our very personal things, like we had a fight with our partner, we have problems with the work, we have problems with sex, we have whatever, the usual stuff that's in the novels from forever, that's always been there. How does that affect the supposedly objective ideas that we have on the outside world? So that's a bit the game of mirrors that the novel does, to try to make the personal world global and to make this globalized world very intimate.
The other thing that strikes me is that as I said, a lot of your protagonists are scientists. Before the pandemic and before the climate crisis, we didn't really see many scientists on television.
Wasn't that better, maybe?
Yeah.
Now I'm starting to think that it was better before.
And then suddenly scientists were in our living room every day, although,
and they don't want to give up. They don't want to go back to their labs. Yes. Yeah. They really liked being on TV. So, yeah.
But also, we used to associate scientists with certainty, with fact. And of course, what we then realized during the pandemic was, and also with the climate crisis, that scientists have different opinions. They're not always right. I mean, and this is one of the themes in Tasmania, isn't it? Is this sense of doubt that grips the scientists?
This is a very, I would say, a very common misjudgment of science, It's like the wide audience thinks that science is about what we know, but every scientist knows that science is mostly a constant relationship to the unknown, and what you really need to be true about in order to be a real serious scientist is always to take into account what you don't know, or what you don't know for certain, which is usually the case. And we saw scientists crossing that line during the pandemic, but not only in that time, many times. Not respecting the unknown of science itself. Why was I saying this?
Yes, actually, there's one of the scientists in the book. He's this physicist, and he's called Jacopo Novelli, and he's at one point he says there are no longer any real political differences, and he's referring to the right and the left in Italy. He said there is only being for or against the truth. and I was really struck by this comment, because I thought actually increasingly in our very polarized world, we define who we are by what we're for or what we're against.
You know, those years that are that these characters go through in the books, 2015, 2020, were in Italy, but not only in Italy, I would say most of Europe, the real years of the rise of populism. So we've been having a populist government for all that time. And all the... One of the things that was most worrying is what populism did to the idea of truth. Scientific-based debates were usually pointless, but that's happening again now. And so there was also, as a form of reaction to this, the idea that, you know, fact-based truth, technicians in politics were the answer to this all. We needed experts and very skilled people doing the right thing. That would have solved anything. But of course, it was a lie. You need good politicians with the right idea to do the right stuff. And so what Novelli somehow stumbles into at some point in the book is a sort of faith in the opposite sense. He has this idea that he's a climatologist, so he's been very frustrated all his life. Climatologists that's one of the things I started from. Climatologists seem to be the most depressed category of all scientists. Yes, yeah. For decades. Yeah. I mean, they know what's going to happen,
and nobody's listening. Yeah,
and they really have. There's a sort of syndrome that has been studied among climatologists.
Really? What's the climatologist depression?
They call it Cassandra syndrome.
Oh, the Cassandra syndrome.
Yeah, or pre-traumatic stress disorder, which is very nice, no? It sounds like we're in pre-traumatic times. But so his faith is that if you give me the right data, I will tell you the truth about the world. And that's a tendency that has been together with populism on the other endpoint somehow. But then something happens to Professor Novelli. I can spoil this anyway. When another professor, a woman, is chosen instead of him for a position, you know, male professors don't really like that in general. So he gives this speech at a conference, and he uses data to basically prove the fact that women are less skilled in STEMs, in scientific fields. It happened in reality. So again, you can have the data say whatever you want them to say.
But this was based on a real story?
Yes.
Yeah. A real scientist, yeah.
I've never said that, but you're not recording. Ah, yes, I even signed that. Okay, whatever.
Well, you don't have to name them.
Yeah, exactly.
Assuming it's a man, though.
But I'm pretty sure it happened not once. I'm pretty sure it happens every day.
I'm sure it happens all the time, yeah.
So you need vision. You don't only need expertise and good data and whatever mathematical models. Whatever you want to state about reality, you need also a vision and an interpretation and a framework, and all human values and biases come into place at that moment.
Now, at another point in Tasmania, a character says, in order to be able to write, don't you have to first live madly? And I thought about this because I know that you have been living a bit madly in the last year or so. I mean, for instance, you've made 2 trips to Ukraine and written 2 incredibly moving pieces of long-form journalism. And not only did you, I mean, you traveled right across the country, a big country, from the west to the front line in the east, and then around Kharkiv, and then down to around Kherson. And you write in your second essay about Ukraine that you went back again a few months later because you began to distrust reality, the reality that you felt sitting in Italy, living this peaceful life, going out shopping, you know, going doing your writing, reading your newspaper, knowing that there was this war so close. I mean, tell us a little bit about your decision to go to Ukraine, and also about this sense of distrusting reality.
Well, I wanted to go since the very beginning of the invasion, so February 2021, 22, sorry. But at that moment, well, it was very confused, and professionals need to be there in those very confusing moments. But I remember I had written half of this book by that time, and for a month I couldn't go on any longer, because it was again like if reality had taken just a much more important role, and it was kind of flooding all the possibilities of escape also, no? But then I did this, then I had to finish this book. There were dates, there were plans, there was everything. So I did a very deliberate act to stop thinking and stop worrying for a few months. So I kind of isolated myself from all the things that were coming, which amounted basically not to open Twitter anymore, or to change the way Twitter was looking at my mind. So no more wars, so there were cats, no more. And then I finished the book and I started promoting it. I was free again to let my mind go there, which seemed to me the only very important thing that was happening. And so I did a first trip in February. The reason was also that I have friends there, people I met during other trips to Ukraine in the previous years. And somehow, what can I say about this? It gets worse. The more you look into that, the worse it gets. The more personal relationships you establish in that place, the more you worry about people who are there constantly, the more this all becomes real and impossible to deny. And still, then I go back to my house in Rome, and I do the usual stuff, and I live as we all do. And the two things are simply impossible to keep together. So in a way, that's what was also in Tasmania in somehow, but on an even deeper level. How do we possibly connect our normal lives to the contemporary things, that really simultaneous things that are happening there. It's simply not possible. And
but I suppose that's what we're doing as human beings all the time.
so I don't have an answer, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I guess as human beings, we have to do that, because if we thought all the time about the apocalypse or the awful things that were happening around, we wouldn't be able to carry on. I mean, that is part of the human condition, isn't it? And I suppose that's one of the things that you're trying to explore, particularly in Tasmania, is how do we manage our inner lives with all of this going on around us?
Also, how we, but it's just, I mean, observational, and maybe it's not true, but my feeling is that since, as we were saying before, these crises look more and more frequent, but also more intense. They kind of enter our lives very violently at some point, so we have these peaks of emotional that at the beginning of the invasion that was very clear. No, we were all shocked. So it was a peak of emotional participation in it. So somehow this happens now very often, but we've also become very good at dismantling that emotional participation. So these emotional peaks are followed by peaks of, not indifference, because it's a moralistic way to put it, but as you say, something we need to shelter ourselves and protect ourselves. So we just put it it becomes background noise very easily and very fast, and that becomes a problem in itself in the whole situations that we deal with. So I think this is very interesting, because it's a way in which the human beings are changing. We all are changing as human beings. It's very new, and it's like we're not very well equipped to deal with this.
Now, I'm going to come to some questions in a minute from the audience, but I just want to ask you, before we went on stage, we were talking about this, you feeling that you've been living much more with reality as a writer, and you said to me, I really want to return to pure fiction.
Yes, and I will.
And is that, first of all, kind of what exactly do you mean by that? And secondly, is that going to be tricky? I mean, will you have to cut yourself off from reality in order, as a writer, to find that pure imaginative space?
You know, in the end, it's a sort of a fake problem, because we, as writers and novelists, we always deal with reality and imagination at the same time. And as we always deal with, like, very personal stuff and made-up stuff, and how it appears more evident or less is just a matter of the book you're writing, I think. But what I don't want to happen is, I mean, I realize there are so many relevant things that we need to discuss and worry about, but and somehow writers are responsible in a way of not letting things go, as most of other people's have to do to carry on, but writers need to stick on something. That's what I think. But on the other hand, I don't want to be blackmailed by reality. I don't want the supposed relevance of things to be more important than what my soul feels is important in that moment. That makes a writer the exact opposite of an expert, because objectivity doesn't really matter in the end. It only matters how your soul is measuring what you're going through. And the hierarchy of things can be completely twisted. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Flaubert. We wouldn't have literature if it weren't also the effort to make relevant maybe in a world of war even, but to make relevant something that is very, very intimate and small and personal. So my idea is just to allow myself this freedom even after this involvement in things.
Actually, that chimes a little bit with the Colombian writer Juan Gabriel Vasquez was on this stage yesterday. And like you, he writes novels, Dan does journalism and non-fiction. And he was talking about the difference, you know, reality and imagination. And he said that what the novel allows you to do that non-fiction doesn't is examine our inner lives, things that are not visible. And it strikes me that there's another theme that runs through your books, right from the very first one. There's obviously the way scientists see the world, but the other thing is loneliness and solitude. You write a lot about that, about what it feels like to be lonely, what it feels like as a human being to try and connect to other people, but not quite be able to reach that. And I wondered why this is. I'm asking a very personal question now. Are you lonely, Paolo? Why are you so interested in the subject of loneliness and solitude?
Because I have a hard time connecting most of the times. I mean, I've become good at it, or at least good at pretending it. But I don't know.
So is that one of the reasons you started writing? Because the protagonist of your first novel, The Solitude of Prime Numbers, I mean,
he really had problems. So I got better from. If I look back at that, I got better.
I think you're doing pretty well talking to a room full of people.
But it's true that there is some core within my characters, and it's probably me that stays and is still unreachable. And I think the funny thing is that I think we all feel that. That's why loneliness is paradoxically the most universal thing we can talk about. In all times, in all ages, in all places. But no, I think the step forward in Tasmania for my personal project of life was that there is a lot of listening. There is a big amount of listening in the book. And maybe the relationships are none of these relationships is fully satisfactory, but it's hard to find one.
It's called connection, yeah.
Yeah, but there are connections, and there's a genuine interest in other people's lives, which, I don't know, it's also connected probably to the fact that we read and write.
Now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. There's one over here. There's a mic coming towards you, so if you can wait till you get the microphone.
Thanks. So thank you for the discussion.
Thanks.
I was wondering, since the panel is called Can Science Address Contemporary Challenges, right? And I guess by science you mean modern, Western, post-Enlightenment science, I guess. And it's interesting to me as a non-Westerner how you think, and I was wondering if you think that Western science has blind spots, not in the methodological sense. I mean, I know that the publishing industry is flawed, we all know that, but in the epistemic sense, in the sense that in the way that we conceive of things, in the way that the kind of questions we ask and in the kinds of knowledge that we glorify, in the sense that those which we can quantify with hard data, we think are worth asking and worth answering, and at the expense of questions or forms of knowledge, like, for instance, indigenous traditions and stuff like this. So I was just curious about your opinion. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a very important subject. I wish I had all the knowledge to answer that. It's something I've been thinking about a lot about lately, and somehow I can answer through an example, something that happened to me while I was writing the book. The main character, me in the novel, is trying to write a book about the atomic bombs. That was before the mainstream phenomenon of Oppenheimer, also before the invasion, and so this common talk about nuclear weapons. So it really sounded a bit old-fashioned while I was starting to write. And actually, for a few years, I was really trying to write something about the atomic bombs. And the interesting thing that I found out was that I thought I knew almost everything one was supposed to know, because I was a physicist, because I knew the calculations, because I had read many biographies of scientists who were involved in the process of making the bomb. And then when I was writing Tasmania, I realized that what I didn't know at all was the most important perspective, which was the perspective of people who were in Japan when the bombs were dropped. It was just so Western, scientifically centered, the narration that I had taken for granted about the atomic bombs. And it's really the narration that we all know. It's the plain perspective, it's the Los Alamos perspective, scientists, male, very male, I mean, probably the most maleist thing humanity has ever achieved. But there were the survivors. There was a completely other perspective, which probably was way more interesting and relevant in a moment when we all felt like survivors to something. And so I contacted one of the survivors, and I interviewed him for many hours. And then I went to Japan as soon as it was possible, although with restriction, to meet him. And I listened to his stories for hours. And somehow every detail, I asked him before, try to be, he's very old, of course. I asked him to be as detailed and not general as possible in the information. And it was quite stunning how he focused on so many details. And each one of them was somehow, each detail was denying part of the Western dominant narration, or at least it was adding something that we didn't think about. It was a completely different landscape on the same thing that I thought I knew. So the very quick answer is yes, I think we're missing a lot. It's not only the Western problem, it's a male perspective on science. After that, I've been working a lot on a writer and biologist who was called Rachel Carson. You probably know her for the book Silent Spring. And the criticism she did to male-centered scientists. So I really think we need to...
Can you just define for us, I mean, what is male, how do you see male-centered science? I mean, how would science look?
Testosteronic. I don't know.
I mean, how would science look differently if we had far more female scientists?
It's counterfactual, so it's very difficult to know. But yeah, that's one thing that is present in Tasmania. It happened to me also. I realized that I had a very male-centered idea of science, because we grow up with the idea that it was done by mostly men. And then there are some books that say, oh no, 'cause these are the female scientists who were there. But it's always like a very tiny field, so we don't really know. And it's not really being questioned, only to a very superficial level. But I would say that we've had a sort of aggressive, testosteronic science, vertical, hierarchical. I don't know if that's, of course, it's a distinction that is very questionable.
Certainly applies to the atomic bomb. I'm going to come to this lady's very keen to ask a
Michaela
question.
Koch, I'm a biologist and philosophy also, and I want to ask you a question which triggers myself quite a long time, and I think it's near to that what you want to express, because I think we follow in our science, in every part of science, the Bacon project from the 16th century, which is triggered by dominance, by instrumentalization and everything, all those things. And I think perhaps, that would be my hope, it's possible that humanism turns out not to be speciesism, and we can produce a more dialogical kind of science, and many people, I think, are on that way, and that would a change of perspective that would be very hopeful, I think.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. And there is you reminded me of a line of Rachel Carson in Silent Spring. She says, today we have so many entomologists, but we don't need more entomologists, we need more biologists. And that's her way to put the idea of a wider perspective. And there's, I actually started in the book from a single moment that's, you know, Enrico Fermi was the most important Italian scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project. And there's this moment that's in his memories, and it's always haunted me, and I didn't know why, and I started from that moment. And somehow it's related to what we were saying. When the Trinity test was done, so when the first bomb exploded, the first atomic bomb in history exploded, you've probably seen this now in the movie. There's this...
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, in the movie. But there's not that moment of Fermi in the explosion. But what Fermi was doing was that he was, like other people, very far away behind a dark shield to protect his eyes and from the radiation, from the light. But what he says is that he didn't see the flash of the bomb directly, because in that moment he had this piece of paper in the pocket, and he turned it into pieces, and when the bomb exploded, he released the pieces of paper, so that when the blast wave, the wave came, of course it pushed the pieces of paper away, and from the distance that they went, he was able to roughly measure the power of the bomb that had just exploded. But what was very interesting for me, I could never really, and I still cannot completely understand the meaning of this gesture, no? This idea of looking away from what you're going to do, from what is going to happen, and instead measure. That's one thing about science. And I mean, I don't mean it in a completely moralistic way again, but still it's a question. It's something, maybe looking Industry would have been
hiding behind the measuring and the data, and rather than facing what it is you're creating. We just got time for one more question here.
Hello.
During your fascinating talk, you said that you did some research for your books. So given your peculiar background, would you define research as a writer and research as a scholar identical? If not, in which way are different aims, features?
Well, thank you. Scholar is definitely too much. The research, well, I think writers sometimes have to do very detailed research, even more than academics sometimes, because you really, especially if you're entering worlds that are not completely your own, other times, other places, you sometimes really need to be detailed in what you... In my case, in case of Tasmania, this was, I would say, less ambitious. It was a bit more of a game. So what writers now usually do is that if they have to write, they shut down internet. They try to isolate from that because it's such so invasive and it's a distraction. And I tried to do the exact opposite. I said, okay, let's see what pops up if I look at different moments in our recent past. And also I try to use all the personal material all the personal archive that technology now gives us. Because I realized that from in those years, 2015 to 2020, I had a whole archive of stuff. Pictures in my phone, WhatsApp chats, mails that I exchanged. And so it was a sort of personal archaeology. That's a way of researching for a novel, for instance. And weird, apparently controversial things came out. For instance, at some point I realized that 2016 or 17, I don't remember which year it was, but the day of my birthday, the terrorist attack in Berlin, the one of the markets, of the Weihnachtsmarkt, happened, was exactly the same day, that evening. The two things had completely detached in my mind. And in my phone, there was only a picture of a big plateau of vegetables that I had prepared for a party. And at the same time, that thing was happening, and I absolutely know that I remember myself watching the news. So how do the two things combine? So I was looking for this sort of small matchings.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. We look very much forward to, well, I hope you're looking forward to reading Tasmania. I'm looking forward to reading the next foray into pure fiction to see whether the reality is bleeding in. But anyway, Paolo Giordano, thank you so much.
Thank you, KIRSTY. Thank you. Thank you very much.